introduced by BN Goswamy. Thank you very much.
May I say it's with great pleasure that I speak of Dr. Daud Ali. We have very little time, close to half an hour, having been chopped from the morning, so I'll be exceedingly brief. Dr. Ali has written extensively. He's currently teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, and this afternoon, it was supposed to be this morning, he's going to speak to us on aesthetics and sensuality, courtly culture in early medieval India. I have no idea, truly speaking, whether he's going to speak to us in Tamil or in Sanskrit or in Pali. I have no idea, because he's expert in all these three languages, apart of course from English and Urdu and whatever. So there's a sense of anticipation, but also a sense of uncertainty. I present to you Dr. Daud Ali. I'll not take time because we have really speaking only about 25 minutes within which to finish this.
Thank you very much, Professor Goswamy. It's a pleasure to be talking to an audience like this on a topic very dear to my heart. I want to preface what I have to say. I mean, there's actually quite a lot written on sensuality and aesthetics in the pre-Islamic traditions in India. And my approach is somewhat different. I'm trained as a historian, and my approach from the outset was to try to articulate a context, a meaningful context for much of the literature that we've received from classical and ancient India. And in that spirit, move away from humanistic approaches to literature, which tend to, from my opinion, flatten literature into a kind of expression of a universal human, a set of universal human emotions. In fact, my approach has been to try to see these texts as somewhat different and try to see them as markers of alterity, quite giving us a landscape of emotion, landscape of feeling, which I think in the end is somewhat foreign to the experience of love and aesthetics that we are accustomed to in modern societies. I also wanted to move away from social scientific approaches, which tend to reduce almost all cultural activity in early India to forms of what one might call legitimation or ideology. There have been critiques of this by Professor Sheldon Pollock and many others. So trying to move away from both of those approaches and see this rich textual tradition in a new type of context. I looked at three particular types of sources, and I found that looking at the different types of sources actually added a tremendous amount of illumination to the problem. And those sources were epigraphic sources, sources which historians are very familiar with, but scholars of literature tend to overlook or ignore. These are temple inscriptions and copperplate inscriptions, which India has a very impressive archive of, hundreds of thousands of inscriptions from the pre-Islamic period of Indian history. These inscriptions are mostly about temple donations and donations to communities of Brahmins, but they include long descriptions of kings and courtiers, donors to these inscriptions, and those descriptions I found particularly useful because they correlate with another type of source I was terribly interested in, which were poems and poetry, the major source that people use when looking at aesthetics. But a third source I looked at were what we know in Sanskrit studies as Shastra, or discourses about how things should be done. And in particular, the discourses on Kama and the discourses on Niti or Artha, the discourses on love and the discourses about polity and policy. So bringing all of those types of sources into dialogue with one another, I took a kind of structuralist approach in the sense that I looked for common themes that ran through the texts and across genres to try to find unities and synergies between these types of texts. I largely discovered that there was a kind of coherence that we can see across these types of sources, which are largely date from about 300 AD to about, 1200 or 1300 AD. This is a period which Indian historians have known as a period of what R.S. Sharma once called the period of Indian feudalism, something we won't talk about, but something which I think in some ways is relevant to the discussion. But sources in this period seem to share a kind of common worldview. And I focused on two themes. The first theme being that of self-cultivation and self-regard, what one might broadly call ethics. And the other theme that I was interested in was the reproduction of certain societies. And I focused on the court. The court as a social locale hasn't really been explored to the degree to which it really merits in the study of ancient India. There's lots of stuff about kings and Brahmins, states and peasant societies, but very little about the groups of elites, aristocratic elites, that largely composed these royal entourages. And it's that context which I found to be the most useful context with which to look at all of these sources, and in which, despite the fact that royal courts are mentioned again and again in these sources, historians and cultural scholars of literature tended to ignore this context. And so I found that when one began to put all of these sources together, an entirely different type of interpretation was possible of these sources. So I'm going to talk about three kind of themes. I'll come to the theme of, I need to keep cognizant of the time. Okay, yeah. So I'll come to the theme of romantic love at the end. In a way, romantic love is the most preponderant preponderant theme of courtly literature in India. And but in order to make sense of why I think romantic love is such a preponderant theme, and not fall back on the tropes, that love is a universal human emotion, or that erotic sensuality is an integral part of the Indian tradition, which of course it is, but it's an integral part of almost every world tradition. And I don't see it being any more important in India than it is, let's say, in classical Greece or medieval Europe or any place else. But Orientalist scholars had made a huge amount of got a huge amount of mileage out of casting India in this kind of over-sexualized way, and I actually don't feel that the sources actually merit that. However, it is true that erotic love is a preponderant theme of Kavya literature. But one conclusion one can make, an obvious conclusion from that, is that people in medieval India were blatantly sensuous and always up to basically making love. This is actually the kind of approach that political agents in the 19th century used routinely to talk about palace vice in the courtly world of the princely states. So, for example, one of the main agendas of political agents that were deputed to many of the princely states was to reform the vices that were the natural disposition of Indian rulers, okay? And so that is a line of interpretation one can take. I choose not to. I don't think Indian rulers were any more concupiscent than rulers anywhere else in the world. Nevertheless, the theme of erotic love is something that needs to be somehow explained. But I think to do that, we need to think more broadly. So to take it back a step, one of the things that emerges in about, we could say, the 300 to 500 AD across the subcontinent is a common political vocabulary. And this is a political vocabulary which today survives only in the religious domain. So if I say the word prasad, anugraha, bhakti, immediately everyone in the audience will think of Krishna. Everyone will think of, temple worship. They'll think of a series of religious significations. But actually, these words, bhakti meaning loyalty or devoted participation to a superior being, prasad meaning the grace, the embodied grace of a superior shown to an inferior, or anugraha, a kind of disposition of favor and grace that one can show, seva, service to a superior. All of these terms have, in the 3rd and 4th century, strong political connotations. They're used in all the Gupta inscriptions to refer not to relations between devotees and God, but to relations between men and other men. And this is an important concept. It's not something that nullifies the religious dimension, but in fact, the point that I would make is that we see these terms emerge in the religious sphere exactly the same time we do in the quote-unquote secular sphere. In other words, we see new notions of lordship emerging in classical, quote-unquote classical India at the same time that we see the emergence of the religions which become dominant throughout medieval India, Shaivism and Vaishnavism, okay? The religions in which these terms are absolutely integral to the basic concepts and which are very distinct and different from earlier religious formations that we know from what's sometimes called Brahmanical religion or sometimes called the Vedic religion, which don't rely so heavily on the terms that I've mentioned. So my point would be that these terms, this political vocabulary, is something which emerges both in the religious and political spheres at the same time. There's obviously a huge amount of interaction between these spheres. It's no surprise that historians for a long time, or scholars of religion for a long time, have been talking about how the origins of puja, or the origins of worship of deities, borrows very heavily from the Raj Upacharas, or the ministrations that were given to kings. Okay, and of course on the other side, historians have been busily saying that, religion provides a vocabulary of legitimation for kingship. Well, I mean, those are obverse ways of saying the same thing, that the languages of lordship that emerge in the Gupta period are largely continuous across these spheres. In fact, these spheres of secular and religious are largely our modern constructions and don't mean much when it comes to looking at the sources. But nevertheless, we do witness the emergence of a common political vocabulary at this time. And so that's something I want to highlight because it provides the very dynamics of relations between men in these aristocratic societies. Sovereignty was built on the vocabulary. I mean, we tend to not understand that, the idea of the abstract ideas of citizenship, of something called the state, these things are largely absent in pre-modern societies. And so the vocabulary of personal affiliation, which is embodied in ideas like bhakti, prasad, seva, all of these terms, okay? This is actually the very glue that holds together these elite societies. I mean, it's not entirely different in the West. When we talk about public service, what does the idea of service mean? The idea of service in the vocabularies of European modernity are largely drawn from feudal notions of subordination and affiliation, okay? They're obviously transformed, but the point is that the vocabularies themselves emerge at a particular time and with a particular coherence. So I focused, next talk a little bit about a theme close to my own heart, about what I might call the education of the body. So concomitant with this political vocabulary was the emergence of a set of gestural codes, bowing, prostration, and an emphasis on demeanor and bearing. This is everywhere apparent in the first text that we have for the composition of drama in India, the Natya Shastra, but not only the Natya Shastra, across the board, the Brihad Samhita, a text on physiognomy, is also explicitly concerned with gesture and movement, bodily movement. And just to take an example, the way I read these sources, the directions for actors as they come onto a stage in Sanskrit drama should make it very clear to the audience which characters were adama, madhyama, and elevated, right? So immediately when a character comes on, the audience understands, much like in medieval drama in the West, immediately understands whether that character will be a villain. Why is this? Because moral being was embodied in bodily movement, okay? And so one can read those directions on what were the proper movements for the uttama characters, the elite, the elevated characters, and the proper movements for the adama or low characters as value systems about bodily movement and bodily disposition. So looking at those sources, one can see that there's an emphasis on the placidity, I suppose, and the deliberation of movement, which was associated with elites, and excess, uncontrolled movement associated with low characters. Overall, there was a strong contrast, obviously, drawn between these groups, and an emphasis not simply on bearing and demeanor, but also on what we call in Sanskrit ingita and akara, the different types of gestures and demeanors of the face and body, how to read them. There's a very famous passage in the Panchatantra where the jackal Damanika and Kartaka are discussing how to read and understand the gestures of Pingalika, their king. And they say to one another that this is really one of the essences of the anujiva, of the courtier's dharma, of how to be a courtier, is how to understand those gestures. It's absolutely essential. So, and this, of course, is borne out by the Arthashastra, which has a whole section on anujiva dharma and the importance of reading gestures. So in addition to general bearing and general demeanor, which indicated elevation and lowness in terms of birth and rank, there was also a preponderance, I suppose, an overweening emphasis on reading particular gestures as emotions related to life at court. So I think, to go back to the Panchatantra, when Sanjivika, the bull, roars in the forest, immediately Pingalika's fear is ascertained by his courtiers by looking at his gestures, and then that begins creates a certain chain of events which are all familiar to us. So, but in addition to this emphasis on hierarchy that we find across the board looking at the discourses on demeanor, there's also an idea that we find of play and grace. And that is something which is also extremely important, denoted by the terms lila, lalita. Again, terms which we understand today as often having a religious signification, but they pretty much go right across the board in quote-unquote secular texts, and there's a whole aesthetics that emerges, I would argue, around playfulness. And so my argument, or my concern, I suppose proposition here would be that this concern with Leela and Lalita and a host of other terms as well is about a kind of controlled spontaneity which is integral to concepts of beauty that emerge at this very time as well, in which it's something almost akin to the Italian notion of spezzatura that we find in Renaissance courtly manuals like that of Castiglione and others, in which a kind of premeditated spontaneity which hides in a way the effort that the courtier exerts to cultivate himself or herself is actually a mark of beauty in and of itself. And so, and it is, of course, it is a mark of power, and one can think of, whether it's Krishna dancing on the serpent Kaliya or King Harsha gracefully resting his foot on a footstool, indicating his mastery. It's interesting that Indian kings typically appear in a relaxed pose when they sit on the throne, never in the rigid pose. I have a couple of slides just to indicate this, comparing Kushan. Could those slides be shown? If not, it's no big deal. If anybody's seen the statue of Kanishka in, is it the Mathura? It's in the Mathura museum.
Yeah.
You see the stance of two legs. I'm really bad at describing bodies. It's a terrible topic I've taken up, but he's standing like this. You also find this on Kushan coins, but when we look at the Gupta rulers, we see what's sometimes called the Tribhanga, or the pose with three breaks in the body. That itself is a I've been told by other art historians that that's a problematic term. But at any rate, the key thing in the representation of powerful figures in the Indic vocabulary is that they're never in rigid postures. They're always in relaxed postures. And this emphasis on ease and relaxation is part of this discourse about Leela and Lalita, which is that essentially extremely powerful people don't or show their power by a bodily a vocabulary of ease, and that's very cognizant. That's very obvious in the depictions of the Gupta rulers, but also pretty much all figures of power from the Gupta period onwards. So I finally want to talk about the question of pleasure more directly, and I suppose here I return to the problem of how to understand the issue of romance in medieval in the sources that we're dealing with, because of its predominance as a theme in Sanskrit kavya. And the first thing to note is that the language of erotic love, anybody who's read Sanskrit love poetry will know that the language of erotic, 10 minutes, yeah, that the language of erotic love conceives of love as a kind of affliction. Very famously, in the section of the Kama Sutra where Vatsyayana is talking about resorting to other men's wives, he says generally one shouldn't do it, but if your life is in danger, it is something you can do. But how would one's life be in danger from being attracted to the wife of another man? Well, that can happen because love is considered to be a kind of affliction. And then he lists then 10 kamasthhanas, which begin with the focus of the eyes on the beloved and end with marana, of death. So, and of course they go through a long process in which the self largely, here we've now got Kanishka, and one more slide, we have the Gupta rulers, one sitting down and the other standing. I won't go back to that now. But so love is considered a kind of affliction which attacks the inner being. I mean, the idea, if one thinks about Indian theories of self, is that you have a soul, okay, and then, but the more less important from a spiritual point of view, but more important from an everyday point of view, aspects of the self beyond the body were, of course, the mind and the senses. And love, or kama, is thought to be something that's mind-born, or manasija, in Sanskrit poetry and literature. And the idea was that somehow what love was it was a capturing of the mind and a subjection, possibly, of the mind by some external object, which created a kind of affliction or a subjugation of that self to that external object. And this is, absolutely rife in the literature on love. Kamadeva, much like Cupid, has a bow. He shoots arrows. The arrows, strike people. They become afflicted, okay? And, you know, the woman's glance is constantly, you know, the bow, the brow is the brew is the bow, and the eyelash, the bowstring, and the glance, the arrow. So this is, I mean, familiar to anyone who knows anything about Sanskrit literature. So the idea would be that when one falls in love, one is actually kind of smitten, literally. And so, and this is of course consistent with you know, the Shastra literature, which talks about ways of gaining lovers, of seduction, of vishrambana, or winning over a maiden, but also people who don't like you. What's called, all of these Shastras, particularly the Kama Shastra and Artha Shastra, have a section at the end called Aupanishadika, or the specialized ways, secret methods of gaining what you can't otherwise gain by your good looks and virility. And so they were typically, in relation to this, typically called Vashikarana. That was one of them. There's also Vajikarana, which is another thing. But Vashikarana was about winning over the will of other people. And that's something that I think tells us a little bit about what these authors thought was going on in the process of courtship. That essentially you were, in a certain sense, subjecting your beloved. And so that the vocabulary of subjection is there. And so my question, you know, reading this, just the vocabulary of it, is, well, what is this really about? Okay? Considering the fact that the audiences of this literature were largely male, the authors of this literature were largely male, okay? What could this literature be doing? So my tentative hypothesis was that this obsession with subjection was actually a displacement of another type of relations between men. Relations of autonomy and dependence were, of course, integral to the functioning of these courtly societies. No one was entirely autonomous, even the king and the highest lords. They were all in some way dependent on the collectivities of the court in these complex hierarchies. And in this world, it seemed to me that the language of erotic love was a way of thinking about relations of autonomy, what's called in Sanskrit texts very explicitly svatantra or paratantra, being subjected to other people. Because indeed, the language of attachment, of anurakta, is something which applies in a certain sense to both the world of love, but also the world of courtly affiliation. Courtiers were thought to be attached to, affectionate towards, and in a certain sense, though no erotic language explicitly is used, but the language of affection has these same dimensions of subjection. And so, you know, kings are often thought to subject their foes by their pratapa or their splendor, and in subjecting those foes, make those foes attached to them. Sakta or anurakta, these terms of affection and attachment or sticking to one's lords and one's superiors was an integral part of the vocabulary of political vocabulary. And my hypothesis is that the discourse on love, in part, was a way that these societies thought about relations between men, thought about relations between superiors and inferiors. Indeed, thought about the very problem of autonomy and dependence, which were rife. Which were the main social options for courtiers. And everyone was, in a certain sense, somewhere on the continuum of dependence and autonomy. And so, obviously, this one could argue that this reduces this literature to politics in a way that is not entirely, atypical of historians and social scientists. For those people who would like to see, for example, all of this literature as denoting and only referring to the realm of the erotic itself. And I would be completely open to that charge, but my rejoinder to that would be that I don't think it's possible to explain this literature and its predominance in these court societies with reference to erotic love alone, that bringing the political dimensions of the societies that consumed and produced this literature is absolutely integral to understanding its currency, as it were, in this world. And so I could say a lot more, and I've actually written and thought a lot more about these issues, but I believe I'm just about out of time, and I don't know if there's time for questions. Probably not. That sounds ominous. That. Okay. Is that? What is that? Sounds like it's a depth chart.
Yeah, is it? There's no time, is it?
Okay.
Yeah. I think we really have to wind up, right?
We can take questions. So if anyone has a question, there is a roving mic just here.
You know, I feel very poorly that a stimulating presentation as the one that we have just heard, we can't really go on with it, or also that we don't have any time for questions. Because this young lady was standing here, making the right gestures, standing in Tribhanga, and using her gestures like this and so on and so forth. So exactly the kinds of things that Daud was speaking of. I don't know what this is.
One at the back. I don't know what
Is
I saw one here. I don't know.
It's a question.
Hello.
it's not mine. No, it's not mine.
So I wanted to ask, how much can we extrapolate from these ideas about the code which you have talked about to
How
the
much can we extrapolate from?
these ideas which apply to the codes of medieval India to the general life? As you said that this was a highly feudal society, so I would assume that the lower levels of society might be radically different from this upper levels. So can we extrapolate at all, or?
Very difficult. I mean, I think over the longue durée, it's actually both interesting and possible to do that. But I think in the period that I'm looking at, we know almost nothing about the practices of the large majority of the Indian population. And I think it's always important to remember that. When we do come to know, I mean, I think, you know, when, in the later periods where the sources allow us to see broader sections of society, I think we find that the picture is very complex. And I mean, you know, taking this outside of the, let's say, courtly type of the stuff that I'm looking at, scholars have for a long time looked at, you know, I mean, Redfield and others who talked about Sanskritization, and they were talking about the adoption of high caste practices by aspiring castes, right, by lower castes over the longue durée. And it's, you know, it'd be very interesting to think about some of these concerns, not simply about erotics, but about self-regard, about issues of bodily comportment, etc., over the longue durée, and think about from those older categories that anthropologists have largely used.
As I said, I'm truly sorry that we really do not have the time to do this, but we're being urged to.
Might I ask a question, please? I have a mic. Yeah, the question is this. So when Kalidas talks about these women whose girdles open, you know, when there's watching in Meghdutam, for instance, they're standing at the windows and, you know, they rush around half dressed and so on. What does that imply? What sort of a society was that?
Difficult to know. Difficult to know.
I beg your
But
pardon?
It's difficult to know with certainty. That's the first thing I say. The second thing I would say is that, I mean, it's not as if these discourses were, you know, completely fantastical. I mean, we do know that there were antapurams and the equivalent of the Islamic term harem. We do know that kings had multiple wives. We know that from inscriptions. And so we know that, you know, for example, the palace dramas that we see in Malvika Mitra and in Harsha's dramas. There are actual political dynamics which we can demonstrate from inscriptions, okay, which seem to suggest that these palace dramas are fantasies, okay, on the one hand, right? So that the idea that the girl introduced in the queen's, entourage is ultimately her sister, she doesn't recognize her, all of that, that's the fantasy part. But the fact that queens had large entourages, the fact that there was always a question of the stability of the royal household when new women were introduced into it, which are the basis of all of these dramas, we can see that in the dynastic politics and how they unfolded from what we know of inscriptions. So in that sense, parts of what Kalidasa is talking about, we know for sure definitely existed. So, I can't characterize that society. It's far too complex, like I can't characterize our own. So
All right, thank you.
We really have to bring this to an end. May I urge you to express our gratitude and compliments to the king.
Thank you for attending the session. Please join me in thanking the speakers Daud Ali and BN Goswamy.